was a passenger on this vessel back in the early 1950s. If you wanted to go to James Island, this was the operating ferry that transited between the island and the Vancouver Island.
I'm Jeff Reichert. I've been working on the Kirk for almost 5 years now, and I am new to the island. I've spent my life on the prairies and always sailed there, but when I came here I found a niche and started volunteering for the Ladysmith Maritime Society. So we've been working on her for 5 years. The history of the Kirkegaard is that it was built by Clark Brothers in Brentwood Bay, and it was built for Canadian Explosives Limited, and they later became Canadian Industries Limited, CIL, which you may recognize. They manufactured explosives on James Island, and they used the Kirkegaard to transport workers from Sydney Spit to James Island daily. And the Kirkegaard made many runs in severe weather, and one of our LMS members has some stories to tell about that, as he was a captain for the Kirkegaard for a few years, and that's Robert Lawson.
There was an explosives factory on James Island off of Sydney from 1912 to 1979. And I was looking for a job, and I went into Manpower in Victoria, and the man said, "Oh, we've got just the job for you. Go and see Jack Horn he'll meet you at the Saanich Wharf across from James Island." So I went out there, and he said to me, "What kind of experience do you have with boats?" And I said, "Well, I've handled boats all my life, but I have no official experience." He said, "That doesn't matter. I'll hire you as a boatman at $5 an hour. And it's a sign of the times. No qualifications required, no certificates of any kind." And so once he was happy that I could run the boat back and forth from Saanich to James Island, 24 hours later I was taking a crew of 30 men back at shift change. And I worked there for about 2 years and it was an interesting place to work. It was this ancient factory, sort of half of it composting back into the forest. There was probably 30 to 40 men working there per shift, and they ran 3 shifts, and we took them back and forth. And there were 3 boats. There was the Kirkegaard, which was the first one built in 1947. There was the PB Yancey, and there was the MJ Watson, which was built the Yancey was built in 1948, and the Watson was built in 1957. All to the same designs by a man named M.C. Hansen, who was a Seattle designer. And the first 2 boats were built, Kirkegaard and Yancey, were built by Clark Brothers Boat Works in Brentwood Bay. And the other one was built by McKay Cormack in Victoria, the Watson. And because they were crew boats, they had to be able to have space for 30 men, so the engines were right in the bow, and with a very long shaft supported on pillow blocks. And by the time I was driving the Kirkegaard at James Island, the east tope had been replaced with a 4-cylinder Lehman diesel. And we never had any particular trouble. I think I only got towed back in once due to engine problems. The mechanics at James Island were a good bunch of guys, and they kept the boats, in good form. And we did the maintenance. They had a big trailer that we'd haul the boats out by the powder dock on the east side of the island, which was where the big train ferry came in and brought boxcars full of gelatin dough, which was 90% nitroglycerin in a dough for making into dynamite at the factory, as they no longer made the nitroglycerin at James Island by that point. And so we would haul the boats out on the beach on this big trailer and scrape and paint and do the maintenance on them there. There was one particular time taking the crew across that was really quite extraordinary. It was a March night, strong tide setting south in the channel between Saanich and James Island, and a very blusterous southeast wind blowing, probably gusting to 60 knots. And a huge sea had built up, these short, steep seas that occur when tide is setting against the wind. And I remember I called the foreman at home, and this was at 11:30 at night. It was the afternoon shift, was ready to go home. And I called the foreman and I said, I don't think it's safe to take this crew across. And he said, well, you don't have any choice. And I said, what do you mean? He said, you take the crew across or you're fired. And so I talked to the people who were getting in the boat, and they all wanted to go home. So off we went. And so we puttered away from the little dock by the Powder Wharf. And that whole area was protected by the long spit that formed this little bay there on James Island. So we came out from the end of the spit, and we headed at 45 degrees up into these enormous seas. And the little boat, the Kirkegaard, just sort of went putt, 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 putt up the wave, and putt, 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 putt down, and putt, putt, putt up. It was slow going, but we made it to mid-channel. And just at mid-channel, I couldn't understand. There was a full moon, and so everything was quite bright, the breaking waves and the tops and the foam. But there was this enormous amount of foam on this wave. I could see ahead of us that we were going up like this. And at the last minute, I realized what it was. It was a giant log surfing off the top of the wave. And that log shot by the starboard side of the boat, probably cleared us by 2 feet. If it had have hit us, no one would have survived. None of the crew noticed it. I was the only one who noticed it. So I got up to the top of the next wave and I swung around, and we made it safely back in, reaching down into Saanich Spit and getting behind the safety of the spit. But it was a close call. And but most of the trips were fairly, most of the time the trips were just back and forth. It was always a lovely job. I mean, the weather was often very nice, the sun was out, and during the day, the people there were 3 boatmen, and if they were on day shift, then they would help around the carpenter shop. I was kind of a gopher during the day shift. On the night shifts, we were night watchmen, and we would wander around the island with our punch clock, punching in all these strange punch stations in the middle of the forest. And the only 2 things would interrupt us. One was the deer. There were stag deer, because James Island had been a hunting preserve before it was a dynamite factory. And the deer had survived after the hunting lodge was gone. And you'd be walking along in the woods, and you were used to the noises, because the whole factory was heated by a giant steam boiler in a powerhouse, and there were steam pipes with relief valves in the woods. So one was used to that noise of the poof of the steam letting off on a relief valve. But the noise you never got used to is as you walked along a path, and there'd be this enormous grunt and snort right by your head, and you'd turn, and here would be this huge fallow deer just standing there. Quite benign, but definitely letting you know that you were intruding on his territory. So, I mean, it was an interesting place to work. It's all gone now. It's all been clear-cut, cleared of all the dynamite factory, and it's now a billionaire's paradise. This photograph here is the approach to James Island coming from Saanich Wharf. The big sand cliffs, the incline railway, and the old Powder Wharf, which was designed and went way out into the water, probably close to 400 yards, and had a big T-wharf at the end where the nitrate ships from Chile used to deliver shiploads of nitrates when the factory was first in production. And the incline railway here was there were railroad tracks on this dock, and then the nitrates were loaded into these cars. This had 2 cars, and it was counterbalanced. So one car would come down, the other car would go up, and there was a big winding engine at the top of the cliff, and that's how you took the crew up every day. And this is the little dock here where the boat's tied up, and one of them, this dock here, was about halfway out the length of the Powder Wharf, and it was all falling down. I mean, By this point, CIL wasn't spending any money. And I mean, if there were places you would wander along on this dock, you would fall through. And in fact, the condition of the wharves were so bad on the other side of the island. There were two large towers, giant wooden towers. Inside each of them was a huge concrete block, probably weighing 4 tons or 5 tons, that allowed this big ramp for the railroad cars coming from the railroad barge to get onto the island. And we were painting the Kirkegaard one summer afternoon, and the ferry came in with the rail cars, and we were painting away. And I looked up and I couldn't understand why the 2 men running the winding engine at the top of the tower had just suddenly jumped off and fallen into the water 40 feet below. Well, then this giant concrete block came crashing down and the tower collapsing on top of it. And there was a large boxcar filled with gelatin dough that rolled over on its side and crashed into the water. And I mean, if something had exploded then, there would have just been a crater, a huge crater. There would have been no Kirkegaard, no dock, no ferry, nothing. There was just a porthole there and there. You only could enter from here. The paneled part of the cabin came back to here, and then there was just canvas inserts here. It had these park bench style benches, and then there were handrails overhead because there wasn't a room for 30 people to sit down, so you had people sitting and people standing holding onto the handrails. The helm was originally in the middle. You stood on a little box here. The engine was up forward, and you stood up a little high, you know, high enough that I remember my head just used to touch the top of the deck head here. And you had pretty good view of what was happening. Yeah. And the boat handles really well. Once you're used to it, they're a lovely sea-kindly boat. Even in appalling conditions, you always felt safe in the boat. And once you got used to docking it, you could just come into the Sandwichdon Wharf. You had to come in and do a U-turn to land with the port side against the dock. And you could just come in at 4.5 knots, do your U-turn, kick it into reverse for about 2 seconds, and the whole boat would just come to a stop and the stern would just kick in nicely to the dock, and you would just step off and tie it up.
The Kirk was used by CIL until 1982, and after that she was used as a passenger vessel, taking passengers to Sydney Island, and then as a whale watching vessel in Johnstone Straits. In 1988 she was abandoned on Hansen Island, and Ladysmith Maritime Society acquired her after that. She went through a quick retrofit at that time and was then used from then until 2016 as a tour boat vessel, taking passengers on tours of Ladysmith Harbour.
We took it out, this is 4.5 years ago, to do the hull, which needs to be done every year. And when we took it out, we had the prop off because the zinc behind it needed to be changed. Put the prop back on, and somebody forgot to put the pin through that keeps the prop on. So the next person to use the boat, when they put it in reverse, spun the prop off, which meant the boat had to come out of the water. Well, we had been talking about redoing it, and the Saravan was finished, so it was out of here. So we decided to bring the Kirk up here and see how bad a condition. We knew it wasn't in great shape. When we got it up here, we found that it was in far worse condition than we had ever realized. There's a lovely timber in there called the horn timber, which if you've got a keel running across the bottom, you have your stem at the front, which is nicely curved to make the bow, and at the back you have the horn timber that goes up and holds the distance between the keel and the horn timber to put the prop in. So that horn timber is another big piece of wood. And we took that out by the handful. It was so rotten that you just got in there with your hands because you couldn't pull pieces off or anything like that. It just fell apart as we were taking it out. We also found some very interesting planks in it. One, we were pulling the caulking out between the planks, and as we pulled it out, the plank fell out, which means none of the fasteners were holding it. The only thing that was holding it was the caulking between the planks. We also found several ribs that were beginning to rot out. We pulled out, I don't know how many planks, there must have been 15 at least. And underneath in the stern, there are some ribs that were actually cut to shape rather than form-fitted either by steaming or by bending. And the ones that were form-fitted were beginning to rot where the planks had made contact with them. So we had to replace those ribs. We also seconded a whole bunch of ribs, which basically means you put another one in beside, because the ones that were in there were falling apart, and it's very hard to actually take a rib out and put a new one in the same place, so you second them. We seconded probably 2/3 of the ribs in the boat. There was a story that at some point it had either fallen off a trailer or had run up on the rocks, and we found that the ribs were cracked all the way down to one side and partially up the other side. So yeah, there was quite a bit of damage when we actually got into it. So we had to replace all the planks, and at the same time we had to pull the whole stern off so that we could get at the horn timber. And again, that was a good thing because there was a lot of rot and so on in there. So that has all been replaced now. There had been a previous refurbishment in the late 80s, early 90s, and at that time they had tried to turn it into a cruising boat so that it had a bench in the side that could make out into a bed. It had a small kitchenette type thing, and it had a big bathroom at one end, all taking up space. The original purpose of the boat had been a crew boat, which meant that all it had was a couple of bench seats down the sides. Built for that purpose, the engine was moved way forward and to make more room to put crew in. Speaking of the engine, we actually moved it back about 2 feet from its original position, which left us a space at the bow that we could turn into a small biffy and lockable storage space. So it's not the boat that it originally was, other than the hull, what's left of the hull, because we've, as I say, replaced a whole bunch of planks in it. This is being done by a bunch of volunteers, none of whom have had shipwright experience before. So in this plan, one of the things we learned by doing the Saravan was that it was very expensive to hire a shipwright to do the whole thing. This time we hired him 1 day a week, so that he came in Monday mornings for 3 hours and trained us in how to do the various jobs. One of the more interesting ones was putting planks in the hull. When he first did a plank in the hull, it took him about 2.5 hours to do a plank. When we did our first plank, it was 2.5 days. But by the time we got the 10th or 12th plank done, it was getting down to the point where we could get 1 plank in a day. Once we got the hull finished and the major, the engine moved, then our shipwright hasn't been back since. So we've been putting the whole top end together ourselves. Since 2018, we have put in 7,396 volunteer hours. After 4 years, we're finally launching her. Culmination of a lot of work. When a boat is out of the water like this, all the boards have a tendency to shrink because they don't have the moisture content around them. It'll take probably 2 or 3 days for it to swell up enough to close off all the seams and to stop the water from coming in.
Well done, John. Not a scratch. You should have just scratched it. You should have just scratched it a little bit, John, just to get it over with, right?
Yeah, right.
Oh, don't worry, we'll scratch her up once we get her on the tour.
Never mind, Dad.
If you want a nice boat, you leave it back in the shed.
And she'll be going out as an ambassador for Ladysmith, as well as when she's officially commissioned as a passenger vessel. We hope to have tours out to outlying islands. There will be day tours for the citizens of Ladysmith and visitors here. And let's hear from the guys that worked on it.
Well, it's been a labor of love. You'd never recognize it from when we first took it apart. Over the 4 years that the Kirkegaard has been out of the water, it's probably been about 15 people. At any one time we have 7 or 8 in the shop. Some of those people are working on the Saravan and other boats that we have, but the bulk of the work has been done on the Kirkegaard.
Yeah, the Kirkegaard is a project I became familiar with about 2.5 years ago when I joined LMS as the executive director. And that boat immediately conveyed the heritage involvement of the organization. And I was really impressed from day one about the dedication of the volunteers that work on this boat. They come here and work here 3 days a week. And I can just do nothing but pull my head in awe and congratulate the team to have achieved this wonderful result today.
Here's to a long life, a safe bottom, and an engine that never quits. All the way, all the best. Cheers to the Kirkgaard.
Yeah.